with that, I now call on Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, Mr. Carson, for a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Great words. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's hearing. While we have several prominent witnesses today, I would especially like to welcome fellow Hoosier, Mr. Kevin Mickey, from the great Hoosier State. Mr. Mickey is the director of the Polis Institute at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. He is also the new chair of the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council of the National Institute of Building Sciences. I look forward to my colleagues learning about the work being done in the great Hoosier State, particularly Indianapolis, to address rising disaster costs and losses, plus the latest report from the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council. Mr. Mickey's national leadership and his local work are terrific examples of what Indianapolis is doing in the field of emergency management. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Carson. We will have two panels of witnesses today. On our first panel, we have our fellow subcommittee member, Carlos Curbelo from Florida. As someone from South Florida, Representative Curbelo knows all too well the risks posed by natural hazards, the rising cost of disasters, and the efforts that have proven successful in Florida to incentivize mitigation measures and smart behaviors. Congressman Curbelo has been a leader in this area and a great advocate for his constituents in South Florida. On our second panel, we'll be joined by the Honorable Joseph Nimick, the Deputy Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, who has been working on ways to reduce the cost of disasters and build resilience in communities to avoid disaster losses. Ms. Sally Clark, Commissioner of El Paso County, Colorado. She is here in her capacity as President of the National Association of Counties. Mr. Brian Kuhn, Director of the Florida Division of Emergency Management and the President of the National Emergency Management Association. He is here to talk with us about his experience as well as help us see things from a state perspective. Mr. Eric Nelson, Vice President, Catastrophe Strategy and Analysis for the Travelers Companies Incorporated, representing the Build Strong Coalition. Mr. Kevin Mickey, Chair of the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council of the National Institute of Building Sciences. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection, so ordered. We have hoped that Chief David Paulson, the former administrator of FEMA, would be able to join us, but he had other commitments. I do have a written statement for the record from Administrator Paulson. I thank him and the Build Strong Coalition for their input on these important topics, and I ask unanimous consent that this statement be included for the record. Without objection, so ordered. For our witnesses here, since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Congressman Curbelo, you may proceed.
Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. This is my first time testifying before Congress, and I'm glad to do it here at the Transportation Subcommittee on Economic Development, especially to discuss the important topic of disaster mitigation. I'm honored to serve with all of you. I'd like to take the opportunity to share some thoughts on controlling the rising costs of the federal government when responding to disasters. I'm a native of South Florida, and my good friend, Mr. Sears, who is working with me on this issue, is from New Jersey. We both have a deep and personal understanding of the devastating impacts of natural disasters on families and communities, and have seen firsthand what happens when homes, schools, and businesses aren't built to withstand the forces of nature. My family and I lived through Hurricane Andrew back in 1992. Fortunately, in my part of town, the damage was not extreme. But just a few miles south, where some of my family members lived, the devastation was horrifying. Being a Floridian, I know that we have pretty strong state building codes already on the books. But at the national level, it is time to fix the broken federal system that is riddled with red tape, waste, fraud, and abuse. There is some great work already being done in the field of pre-disaster mitigation, and I'd like to thank Chairman Barletta for being a strong leader on the issue. Over the last 30 years, we have seen a significant increase in federally declared natural disasters. But instead of taking additional steps to focus more on preparing for these disasters, with enhanced building codes to make communities safer, the federal government typically waits until after a disaster occurs to react. This is incredibly dangerous and costly, especially with the increase in extreme weather events. According to the Weather Channel, this hurricane season is supposed to be the most active since 2012. So this hearing and these issues are of the utmost importance and very timely. For these reasons, my friend, Mr. Sears, who knows firsthand in New Jersey just how costly cleanup is after a disaster, have introduced legislation to work towards promoting stronger building codes at the national level by introducing H.R. 5177, the National Mitigation Investment Act of 2016. This legislation works to alleviate losses to resident and commercial property following a natural disaster through preventative measures. It would provide incentives for the adoption and achievement in enforcing state building codes. We do this by allowing the President to increase mitigation assistance following a natural disaster by 4% based off of the price of cleanup, but only if the state is enforcing building codes. This incentive can encourage states and localities to be proactive in future building and also save a lot of funds in the long run. The bill would also create a pilot program to award grants to state and local governments to encourage the adoption and enforcement of nationally recognized building codes. The goals of the grant program are to reduce disaster response and recovery costs by increasing resilience of buildings and reducing the amount of damage that occurs due to disaster and chronic flooding. Grant awardees will be required to accomplish these goals with non-federal matching funds, no less than 25%, and FEMA will be required to provide reports back to Congress on the success of the program. Mr. Chairman, the residents of both Florida and New Jersey have had to rebuild communities after the devastating effects of catastrophic natural disasters. Returning to a life of normalcy is tremendously difficult and can take many years. Furthermore, chronic tidal flooding poses a significant threat to real estate along our waterfront communities, especially in my South Florida district and the constituents that Mr. Sears represents as well. This undoubtedly affects insurance rates, property values, clean water supplies, and general public welfare. We believe that through preemptive methods of incentivizing state and local governments to adhere to stronger building codes, we will alleviate the burdens and costs of the federal government after a natural disaster. I thank my friend, Mr. Sears, for working with me on this legislation. I look forward to hearing from other experts on the issue of disaster mitigation in the next panel. This is a topic that requires perspectives from diverse geographical locations and multiple industries. And I appreciate being able to discuss my bill today. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your testimony, Congressman Curbelo. I will now begin the first round of questions, limited to 5 minutes for each member. If there are any additional questions following the first round, we'll have an additional rounds of questions as needed. While we usually do not have questions for members of Congress, Mr. Sears is an original co-sponsor of Mr. Curbelo's legislation and has a few questions.
I really thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to ask Mr. Curbelo questions because we've been working on this for a while, but I do want to thank you. You and I have firsthand experience on how devastating some of these catastrophes are, how it impacts life, how it impacts community, how it impacts the economy. And I really want to thank you for taking strong lead on this. You and I, New Jersey got hit hard, Florida's been hit hard, and I just want you to know that I think this is the way to go. You know, investing in mitigation, especially on a national level where we can put some real strong codes, it's always been on my mind for many years. So I just want to thank you for your hard work, and I look forward to continue and be proud to work with you on this legislation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Mr. Costello? No? Thank you. Member Carson?
No, sir.
If not, then we thank you very much for your testimony. Your comments have been helpful to today's discussion. We will now call our second panel. I remind you of the subcommittee's request to limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes, and we'll give everyone a chance to be seated. Thank you very much. Deputy Administrator Nimick, you may proceed.
Good morning, Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, and the members of the subcommittee. As you know, my name is Joe Nimick. I'm the Deputy Administrator for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Thank you for this opportunity to testify about the efforts FEMA is undertaking to reduce the rising cost of disasters. With the continued trend towards urbanization, particularly in large cities located in high-risk areas, and the increasing severity of weather events, the nation faces the potential for ever-increasing costs in responding to and recovering from disasters. During a disaster response, FEMA's primary goal is to support the survivors through effective, efficient operations. Though FEMA has procedures in place to control costs during a response, one of the most effective ways to reduce disaster costs is to invest in community resilience before a disaster strikes, thereby reducing the physical and financial and particularly the human impacts of the event. Preparedness and mitigation investments made before a disaster strikes significantly lessen the financial impacts on communities, states, and the nation. One of the most effective mitigation tools is establishing stringent building codes and standards that ensuring the property is built to insurable levels. Let me repeat that. Building codes and standards that ensure the property is built to insurable levels. You'll hear multiple times today that for every dollar invested in mitigation, a savings of $4 is achieved due to the reduced impacts post-disaster. Mitigation programs reduce costs to the American public by an estimated $3.4 billion annually. I have to move off my prepared comments to thank this committee and the Congress for taking actions such as the post-Sandy legislation, where we were able to move the recovery costs forward based on assessments, but add the mitigation costs at that time so that the building back is better and reduces the future potential. FEMA has made significant strides in the last few years, bringing the larger emergency management community together around a national preparedness system. This provides communities a common approach to managing the risks and provides communities the information, tools, and funding they need to make informed, data-driven decisions. This is just one step FEMA takes in promoting resilience. The National Flood Insurance Program serves as the foundation for the national efforts to reduce loss of property from floods, the most costly and frequent disaster in the United States. The program identifies areas at risk for flooding and makes flood insurance available to participating communities. Within the NFIP, the Community Rating System initiatives communities to implement floodplain management practices, offering lower NFIP insurance premiums to participating communities. Additionally, FEMA provides hazard mitigation assistance through programs such as pre-disaster mitigation, flood mitigation assistance, hazard mitigation grant programs. These provide funding to communities to implement hazard mitigation measures pre- and post-disasters. Programs such as the NFIP and the Community Rating System and Hazard Assistance invest in community resilience before the disaster strikes. This year, FEMA went a step further, developing the disaster deductible concept, which encourages states, tribal, and territorial investment in resiliency mitigation programs. I strongly believe this program will be critical to any effort to reduce future disaster costs in a significant way. As you've indicated, Congressman Barletta, Congress, the GAO, and others have indicated that the federal cost of disasters continues to rise. The solution of moving the threshold higher merely distributes the cost differently, but does not reduce the cost of potential disasters. With the disaster deductible concept, states would have to meet a predetermined financial commitment similar to meeting an insurance deductible as a condition of receiving federal funds to rebuild damaged facilities and infrastructure. Additionally, FEMA would provide credits for those states' investments in resiliency measures, such as adopting the Building Enhanced Codes or funding preparedness and mitigation projects. Using these credits, a state's deductible could be reduced, thereby ensuring that communities have an incentive for investing in resilience. During a 60-day comment period, FEMA received 150 responses. We're currently evaluating those to provide input from the advance notice of proposed rulemaking to develop a proposed rulemaking for later this year. While preparedness and mitigation efforts can help us to reduce the cost in many areas, we must continue to acknowledge that demographic patterns are not something we can easily or readily influence, but we can take steps to account for these patterns by improving building codes, promoting preparedness. FEMA strives to invest in our nation's resilience and support disaster survivors while being good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. We continue to look for innovative ways to encourage risk reduction, promote preparedness and mitigation planning, and efficiently implement the recovery programs in order to reduce both the risks and costs to the American taxpayer. Thank you for this opportunity today to testify, and I look forward to any questions the subcommittee may have.
Thank you for your testimony, Deputy Administrator Nimick. Commissioner Clark, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify before you today on the cost of disasters. My name is Sally Clark, and I'm a county commissioner from El Paso County, Colorado, and also serve as the president of National Association of Counties, which represents all of America's 3,069 county governments. Although all parts of government play a role in disasters, counties often serve as the first line of defense when a disaster strikes and are responsible to help our communities recover in the aftermath. Whether it's our emergency managers or sheriffs or 911 call centers, county hospitals or public health departments, or the fact that we own the majority of our nation's infrastructure, like roads, bridges, and airports, federal policy decisions regarding disasters have a major impact on counties. My county is no stranger to disasters, and the topic of this hearing is personal for me. Over the past several years, El Paso County and our surrounding areas have been devastated by a series of wildfires and flash floods that have upended our residents' lives, strained our local economy, and caused enough damage to prompt 4 presidential disaster declarations over a 3-year period. Our county, which long ago inspired Catherine Lee Bates to write the famous hymn, America the Beautiful, is now home to charred, barren hillsides, and the vegetation that once protected the area from stormwater runoff has disappeared, paving the way for dangerous flash floods. But we have been working diligently to help our community recover and become more resilient in the future. Today, I respectfully submit 3 principles for your consideration as you continue to discuss federal disaster spending. First, federal disaster spending should be viewed in the context of corresponding spending by state and local governments and the capacity of each level to fund disaster recovery efforts. Thousands of disasters strike our nation each year, and the vast majority of long-term recovery costs are carried on the backs of state and local governments. According to NACO's analysis of FEMA data, over the last 10 years, 92% of counties across the nation had at least one FEMA-declared disaster. And according to materials published by FEMA, the number of disasters successfully handled without requests for federal assistance is estimated at 3,500 to 3,700 annually, while only about 35 disasters per year received major declarations triggering federal assistance between 1953 and 2014. Furthermore, it is important to consider the respective fiscal capacity of federal, state, and local governments when assessing contributions to our nation's recovery from disasters. County governments in more than 40 states operate under restrictive revenue constraints imposed by state policies, including caps on property taxation that limit counties' ability to raise additional funds in the face of rising disaster costs. Local governments spend significantly on disasters, and changes to federal disaster spending should not be assessed without consideration of this. Second, decreases in federal disaster spending should not come at the expense of state and local governments. The ultimate result of shifting federal disaster costs to state and local governments will further deplete resources available for proactive disaster mitigation and resiliency work, resulting in even costlier disasters in the future. FEMA's disaster deductible proposal presents some serious challenges for local governments. For example, El Paso County has spent many millions of dollars on mitigation projects in the last several years as we have worked to recover from the wildfires and flash floods that have ravaged our community, including loss of life. But under the disaster deductible proposal, if the state of Colorado fails to sufficiently invest in mitigation efforts, public assistance funds could be withheld from our county at times when we are in most need of federal assistance. In this way, we could be punished because of the inaction of an entity over which we have no control, despite our best efforts in mitigation. And this is just one of the many issues with this proposal that thus far have not been sufficiently addressed. Because of this, FEMA has not given local governments confidence that a disaster deductible could be implemented without the significant risk that it would simply shift disaster costs from the federal government to state and local governments. And finally, local disaster mitigation efforts bring down the overall cost of disasters and should be supported by the federal government. Counties are uniquely positioned to implement mitigation efforts through our regulatory authorities and convening powers. Collaboration with the federal government helps counties better utilize our authorities and resources to mitigate the damage caused by disasters, increasing community resiliency, and decrease the impact and costs of future disasters for all levels of government. FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and the other federal programs enable counties to undertake large mitigation projects that may otherwise be out of their reach and have tremendous potential to drive down the cost of disasters for all levels of government. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Carson, and members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you again for inviting the local perspective on this important conversation, and I would welcome any questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Clark. Mr. Kuhn, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Brian Kuhn, and I am the Director of the Florida Division of Emergency Management. I'm here on behalf of the National Emergency Management Association, which represents the state emergency management directors of the 50 states, territories, and the District of Columbia. As the frequency, intensity, and variability of disasters increase, it is imperative to reduce risk wherever possible. This will ensure that our scarce personnel and financial resources are focused on life safety and those aspects of the built environment where the risk cannot be reduced. NEMA believes the following. Meaningful cost reduction should impact all levels of government and the private sector and not simply shift the cost between stakeholders. The government practice of spending more money on disaster recovery than risk reduction must be changed. Hazard mitigation is a cost-effective effort with a documented return on investment. Mitigation reduces response costs and speeds recovery. Integrating mitigation meaningfully into recovery can be the catalyst for a community-wide focus on preparedness in the future. Mitigation and resilience activities by state, local, and tribal governments should be recognized and incentivized by the federal government. In the long term, cost savings will be realized at all levels. Much of the legal authority and responsibility for risk reduction decisions and activities resides at the local level, such as adoption and enforcement of building codes, zoning, and land use decisions. Local and tribal governments are critical partners in creating and sustaining disaster-resilient communities and must be engaged in this conversation. All stakeholders must utilize the best available science and predictive analysis tools to illustrate data-driven result on investment calculations. This can only be done when data is made available to all stakeholders and when calculations are not done in a vacuum. We must leverage data to support our risk reduction priorities. At the urging of Congress, FEMA has undertaken various efforts over the last decades to reduce cost and streamline operations. Re-engineering of the public assistance program is an excellent example of FEMA working to improve and maximize existing programs. While it is still too early to determine the effectiveness of the change, we are pleased with the effort and urge that similar reforms be considered in other federal programs. Investment into the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, or EMAC, leverages federal grant dollars that have already been invested in state and local emergency management programs. We must encourage greater investments as states work with one another to reduce the need for federal assistance, federal administrative costs, property damage, and most importantly, save lives. In January, FEMA proposed a concept to create a state deductible for federally declared disasters. While there was no consensus opinion among the states, many expressed these common beliefs about any new proposal. The concept should drive real reduction in costs at all levels and not merely a shift in costs. An appropriate amount of time must be given to ensure successful implementation, including internal education for FEMA and training and guidance for states. States must also be given adequate time to ensure that any budgeting requirements are understood and acted upon by state legislatures. The proposal should utilize the opportunity to decrease administrative burden and associated costs. And the deductible cannot result in delayed assistance to those in need. Regardless of what happens with the disaster deductible or any other current initiative, real progress will be achieved when all critical stakeholders are engaged. I'd like to wrap up with a few thoughts on where we go next. The federal government should continue to offer incentive programs that allow states to pursue innovative ways to strengthen their communities. We recommend FEMA and other agencies continually evaluate these programs to better understand the things that deter or prevent communities from fully leveraging these opportunities. NEMA also recommends that a study to determine the true cost of disasters be conducted that captures not only those direct financial costs borne by FEMA, but also those costs, both direct and indirect, that are paid by other federal agencies, state, local, and tribal governments, and the private sector. Position FEMA as a partner in developing a more resilient nation. FEMA's focus must transcend response, and the agency must make advancements in all phases of the disaster cycle. Mitigation and long-term recovery are societal investments, not a cost. Many of the functions that FEMA fulfills during a disaster could be done in a more cost-effective manner by using personnel deployed from tribal, state, or local government through EMAC. Invest in the infrastructure necessary to achieve this goal. In addition to improving currently existing federal programs, FEMA and others should recognize outstanding efforts done by state and local entities and encourage their adoption nationwide. While many stakeholders approach the issue of increasing disaster costs differently, we all have a common goal. As government officials, private sector business leaders, and community members, we all have a role to play in reducing the cost and impact of disasters. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today and stand ready to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Kuhn. Mr. Nelson, you may proceed.
Good morning. Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this important hearing today to examine solutions to controlling the increased costs of natural disasters. My name is Eric Nelson, and I'm Senior Vice President of Catastrophe Risk Management at Travelers Insurance. I'm testifying today on behalf of the Build Strong Coalition, a group of businesses, consumer organizations dedicated to reducing human and economic losses from natural disasters. As one of the largest property casualty companies in the U.S., Travelers provides a unique private sector expertise that can add value to the federal government's mission in its own risk and losses from natural disasters. I'd first like to thank Chairman Barletta and the members of the subcommittee for their continued leadership in conducting a series of roundtables on this topic beginning in January of last year. I begin today by outlining three major takeaways from that emerging from those roundtables. And before I do that, the main question we want to ask ourselves is what actionable steps can Congress take to mitigate risk, lessen the impact to families and communities across America, and reduce federal losses from natural disasters? The first takeaway from the roundtables is that by almost every measure, federal disaster spending is increasing on an unsustainable path. Dr. Erwin Michel Kurjan from Wharton showed that exploding federal cost share of natural disasters over the last 60 years, increasing from roughly 6% in 1955 to 77% in 2015. The second takeaway from the second roundtable is that states, communities, and individuals have little incentive to undertake loss prevention measures before a disaster occurs. We're going to hear in a minute, the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council conducted a study documenting how every dollar spent on mitigation saves the nation approximately $4 in post-disaster relief costs. A new study by Wharton indicated that a $1 increase in the Individual Assistance Grant Program reduces disaster insurance demand by $6. These findings represent compelling evidence that the federal government is inadvertently fostering short-sighted behavior throughout state and local governments and with individual homeowners. The third point from the roundtable is that eliminating disincentives and replacing them with the appropriate incentives for mitigation can benefit all parties involved. The federal government would benefit by lowering its cost share for disaster assistance. States would benefit by alleviating the budget constraint caused by disasters and easing their dependency on federal aid. Families would benefit by reducing personal disaster costs and protecting loved ones. Communities and local economies would benefit by enabling citizens and businesses to recover more quickly after an event. While the benefits are clear, the question remains, what specific actions can Congress take? The National Mitigation Investment Strategy is based on the latest science and engineering research from world-class research institutions such as the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, or IBHS. IBHS and other research institutions conduct research on building performance standards and simulated disaster conditions in controlled environments. Research from these institutions demonstrates that statewide adoption and enforcement of building codes can reduce long-term risk. Studies conducted in the wake of major disasters also support this finding. Another fact, according to IBHS, at least 25% of all businesses that close down for 24 hours or more during a disaster never reopen. That's staggering stats. And think about the businesses and the jobs. Another stat we looked at was the LSU Hurricane Center estimated that stronger building codes would have reduced wind damage in Hurricane Katrina by 80%, or $8 billion. So thank you for your leadership of Congressman Curbelo and Congressman Series. I am pleased to report that the core principles from this report have been turned into the legislation and introduced in H.R. 5177, the National Mitigation Investment Act. This act provides a powerful incentive for states to adopt and enforce statewide building codes and authorize a first-of-its-kind competitive grant program to improve building code enforcement. Further, the legislation includes a provision authorized by the chairman in H.R. 1471, authorizing Congress to look at the first comprehensive assessment of federal disaster spending by Congress in over 20 years. Congressional leaders, policy experts, and GAO all agree strong building codes, enhanced pre-disaster mitigation settings would provide life and cost-saving benefits. I urge you and your colleagues to support the National Mitigation Investment Act in order to rein in federal government's exploding costs. Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, and the subcommittee, I applaud you for your efforts and thank you for taking up this issue. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Nelson. Mr. Mickey, please proceed.
Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on approaches for reducing the cost of natural disasters. My name is Kevin Mickey, Director of Professional Development and Geospatial Education at the Polis Center at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, which has the mission of linking academic and community expertise to create strong and resilient communities. I am here today as the chairman of the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council of the National Institute of Building Sciences, introducing a new and unique approach we have proposed for the incentivization of private property owners throughout the United States. The United States Congress established the National Institute of Building Sciences in 1974 to serve as an authoritative source for both the public and private sectors to improve the built environment. To achieve its mission, the Institute has established 18 councils that engage building industry experts in examining and developing tools, technologies, and practices to meet identified needs. The Institute and its Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council, or MMC, and Council on Finance, Insurance, and Real Estate have been particularly focused on opportunities to advance resilience and encourage the most cost-effective approaches to reducing the impacts of natural as well as man-made disasters. As you are aware, there have been numerous efforts at developing increased building codes and standards, mitigation programs, scientific studies of best practices, and definitions of resilience. And yet we continue to find that the penetration of hazard mitigation into the private sector is spotty and woefully incomplete. Now, this is not to say that these efforts have not been effective. As has already been pointed out, a 2005 MMC study showed that implemented mitigation strategies do indeed save on the order of $4 for every dollar spent. And currently, the Institute is discussing with federal agencies and the private sector a project to revisit this 2005 study and expand it to consider all federal programs, the role of the model building codes, and the benefits of mitigation provides to the private sector. Recognizing the significant benefits achieved through proactive investments in mitigation, the limited funding available to support disaster mitigation, response, and recovery, as well as the anticipated increase in disaster events, a new approach is necessary. The most cost-effective manner to achieve resilience is through a holistic and integrated set of public, private, and hybrid programs that capture opportunities available through investment in mortgages and equity real estate, insurance, finance, tax incentives and credits, grants, regulations, and enhanced building codes and their application. This focus on leveraging private public sector opportunities to induce corrective action is called incentivization. The incentivization approach calls for input, consensus, leadership, and action from a broad spectrum of stakeholders representing the financial, regulatory, and economic processes that need to be developed and coordinated to make incentivization part of the nation's economic fabric. Participants should include those who offer incentives, such as insurance and finance-related companies, lenders, and foundations, as well as forward-thinking communities and government agencies, and important decision makers that most definitely need to include homeowners, businesses, and utilities. The MMC and CFIRE jointly published and developed a white paper entitled Developing Pre-Disaster Resilience based on Public and Private Incentivization, which provides a catalog of existing programs for different hazards that private and public sector stakeholders can evaluate and then modify or expand to develop incentives. The specifics of incentivization need to be tailored for new and existing construction using optimal resilience measures beyond current law or custom and to account for hazard, risk, locality, business size, and the value of resilience strategies. One size cannot fit all. Incentivizing the means to achieve resilience before disasters occur focuses on monetizing the benefits for incorporating risk mitigation practices in the ordinary course of business. Participating stakeholders need sufficient confidence that using incentives to achieve resilience will justify investments, underwriting, and loan and grant programs. The private sector will not undertake resilience investments just because it's sensible, but because it's economically prudent. While my written testimony describes many opportunities for congressional action, I offer a few specific recommendations here. First, every federal dollar associated with construction, community development, and infrastructure must include a requirement that the latest building codes be met or exceeded. Second, Congress and federal agencies should examine all programs, particularly grant-making programs, to identify opportunities to support resilience. And finally, federal investments and programs should require investment in mitigation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before today. Please consider the Polis Center as well as the National Institute of Building Sciences as resources as you look to address challenges related to the built environment. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Mickey. I will now begin the first round of questions, limited to 5 minutes for each member. If there are additional questions following the first round, we will have additional rounds of questions as needed. Deputy Administrator Nimick, why are the big disasters costing so much money now, and what factors do you think are driving this change? And then I'd also like to hear Mr. Kuhn and Mr. Nelson's thoughts on that.
Congressman Barletta, I think the biggest challenge is the continued movement of populations into high urban areas that happen to have been developed from historic perspectives in very dangerous areas, along our rivers for flooding, along our coastlines for major storms, and on earthquake faults. The reality of people moving to the cities is one that we're going to face for the foreseeable future, and that only increases the potential of costs. Additionally, the value of property has gone up substantially over time, and therefore the recovery costs continue to go up. What it costs to build a mile of roads 30 years ago is very different than what it takes to build a mile of roads today. The only solution is, in fact, building for those future states that we look at in terms of culverts that can maintain the flow of water, bridges that are better maintained, all of the infrastructure that needs to be there, as well as public buildings built to standards that allow for the potential of future disasters to be minimized.
Mr. Kuhn, Mr. Nelson.
Yeah, just to add to that, the wealth effect that's happened in America since the 70s. Clearly, the average home size has increased by about 1,000 square feet. Echoing the comment, more and more Americans moving to areas that have higher risk. But adding on top of that, we see it in our statistics. If you're growing in an area with poor building codes versus good building codes, we see it in the claims data. We see it where we shouldn't be seeing claims, we see claims at low wind speeds, at small hail sizes. there's a better way forward, and we see it for states like Florida that have had very good adoption of building codes. There's proven studies that have shown how much it's benefited. So just to add that conversation.
Mr. Kuhn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I concur with both Mr. Nimick and Mr. Nelson. I would also add, I believe that over time there has been a better understanding and better utilization of the funding that is available to communities after those types of disasters, and so perhaps we are fully recognizing all of the ways that we can use those federal, state, and local dollars to help the community recover. I believe there's also probably an additional cost on the administrative oversight of those programs and the program requirements to affect the recovery and subsequent mitigation. Those recovery programs can often stretch into the decades for some of our larger disasters, and so the administrative costs associated with those also add to those higher costs.
Deputy Administrator Nimick, we continue to see new disaster aid programs emerge ad hoc in reaction to disasters. They all seem to have different rules and requirements and do not seem well coordinated or focused on obtaining the best outcomes. Don't FEMA programs contain strict requirements on eligibility, use, and cost effectiveness? And are you aware if other agency disaster programs include such requirements? And is this something that Congress should take a look at so that we can continue, that we can streamline these programs and ensure that they are cost effective?
Congressman Barletta, you're absolutely correct that we have very stringent codes and requirements in order to qualify for federal dollars. And as Mr. Kuhn pointed out, they often take a great deal of oversight to ensure that they are effectively and correctly implemented. I can speak through the Sandy legislation that there was a requirement to capture all of the different agencies, including HUD and Federal Transit Authority, to ensure we had a more complete understanding of where the different investments in recovery were going. That is not consistent across all of the different disasters that exist. I will tell you that this year, for the first time, the administration passed the Federal Flood Risk Management Standards that require every agency for every federal dollar that's invested in recovery to meet a standard for the first time. That includes the Department of Defense as well as all the other agencies. So there are activities going on to try to ensure that we all build to a high standard, but the capture of those costs is not something that we currently do.
Now I recognize Ranking Member Carson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Mickey, in terms of community buy-in, various reports have been released about the rising costs of disaster, the benefits of mitigation, and the need to take steps to mitigate for disasters. So Congress has also acted to incentivize mitigation. So, for example, we authorize FEMA to provide additional hazard mitigation grant program funding to states with enhanced plans, yet only 12 states have adopted these. So even with incentives, it's very difficult to get states to take action. How do we get the ideas in your report to the public and private sectors, and what is needed to actually get ideas implemented?
Well, I'm happy to say that we've already taken some steps in that direction. Just this past January, the Institute held a symposium here in Washington, D.C. That institute brought together experts in the industries that I identified in my testimony for the purpose of discussing exactly what was presented, and more importantly, to share their own ideas for how to incentivize resilience in their respective sectors. The next step that the Institute is currently pursuing is to develop a stakeholder leadership council that consists of the leaders of the various stakeholder groups, to include insurance, loan organizations, bond writing organizations, businesses, utilities, homeowners, and, of course, local, state, and federal government. And the goal of that council is going to be to work on formulating the mechanisms for incentivization. The idea that we have is that by getting the buy-in of these stakeholders directly, because they will be the ones coming up with these incentive strategies, that others will then follow, and they're going to be incentivized to help build an enhanced economy that does not currently exist for writing insurance, originating loans and bonds, and generating construction activity. Ultimately, the goal as we see it is to produce a set of products that consumers want. Let me give you a couple of examples that you'll find in our full study. State Farm Insurance offered a premium discount in Texas for installation of impact-resistant roofs. The result was that products related to impact-resistant roofs went from 10 in 1998 to more than 1,000 in the year 2003, and that program has now expanded out into 26 additional states. According to State Farm homeowners, the IRR product, the impact-resistant roof product, is something that they now want. And then just earlier this week in Washington, the mayor of the city of Fairhope, Alabama, Tim Kant, was attending the Resilience Building Codes Forum, and he made a statement that his community is now considered one of the most desirable places to live, specifically because their homes are recognized as being more resilient, and that community is one of the places where the Fortified program is found. The Institute is planning to serve the role of identifying these solutions that I've mentioned. We recognize that there are plenty of best practices out there. What we want to do is bring together the stakeholders to identify those best practices and see them replicated across the industry. We recognize that costs are high and we're looking for ways to reduce them, and we believe that this is a creative approach. Ultimately, we believe that activities such as implementing building codes need to be started to be viewed as a carrot, not as a stick. And if the incentives are appropriate, we think that can happen.
Thank you. Mr. Kuhn, you mentioned FEMA's new customer service-centric focus for the public assistance program as a positive step forward. Are there other actions FEMA could take with respect to the public assistance program in order to reduce disaster costs and even losses?
Thank you, Ranking Member Carson. I believe that continued implementation of some of the procedures that were highlighted in the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act in ways that will help us expedite funding to the locals could result in cost savings and improved recovery as we move forward. We are eager to continue to work with FEMA on this PA reengineering process to make sure that they are as customer-centric as possible in this situation so that we can help, again, get those communities back up on their feet as quickly as possible at a minimal cost to the federal government. With regards to the question you asked, Mr. Mickey, earlier with regard to incentives, if I may, we have done a very good job on providing incentives for programs. You mentioned the Enhanced Mitigation Program. There are incentives offered through the National Flood Insurance Program, Community Rating System. There are incentives offered through the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act for debris removal. None of those, I believe, have fully met what they intended to do. And so continual reevaluation of those incentive programs to determine why they are not being taken up at the level we anticipate would be necessary, and then go back and improve the processes by which we implement those programs would help them meet the maximum good that they were designed to intend to affect.
Thank you. And Administrator Nimick, earlier this week, the White House hosted a conference on resilient building codes. Included in the fact sheet issued by the White House, it stated that FEMA is developing a more detailed plan to be put forth for additional public discussion in a notice of proposed rulemaking. Has FEMA finished reviewing all of the comments and arrived at determining that it will definitely go forward with rulemaking on disaster deductible concepts? If so, when can Congress and stakeholders expect the proposed rule to even be issued?
Representative Carson, thank you for the question. The deductible process has been one where we've reached out heavily to the user group, and as Ms. Clark indicated, we've received over 150 very detailed responses to the advance notice of rulemaking. And we went through the advance notice of a rulemaking process in order to get that type of feedback that Ms. Clark indicated, where there are concerns that this might just be the ability to transfer costs from the federal government to state and then to local communities. The intent here is exactly what we've been talking about, to incentivize and make more consistent the ability for communities to invest in mitigation and preparedness capabilities. We are now going through those 150 comments to be able to come up with an actual proposed rule that will have details in it that we will then go out through the proposed rulemaking process to get specific comments back on those rules. We anticipate that that will be out sometime this calendar year, sir.
Thank you. And I don't know where we are on time, Mr. Chairman, but I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Carson. Mr. Graves, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Nimick, who's in charge within the federal government of our national efforts in terms of community resilience? Which agency?
So as you would expect, Congressman, FEMA, through the National Preparedness Program, provides the guidance for the federal government to be able to assist state and locals in developing their preparedness programs. And FEMA, working with the states through their threat, THIRA, their threat estimating program, as well as their preparedness reports, captures that information as well as for the federal government.
Okay.
But each agency themselves are responsible for their support to the preparedness plan.
Got it. So do you acknowledge, Administrator Nimick, do you acknowledge the statistics that Mr. Nelson referenced in regard to studies indicating that proactive investments in hazard mitigation generate cost savings?
Yes, sir. I said it in my opening statement, and that's what the deductible process is trying to attend.
Do you see any of the work of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as being efforts to reduce hazards or address mitigation strategies?
Sir, we work closely with the Army Corps of Engineers.
If you don't mind, just a yes or no, I'd appreciate it.
Sir, I'm not comfortable answering just a yes or no, but would do so for the record. We work very closely with the Army Corps of Engineers, and I do believe that an awful lot of their efforts go to reducing the impacts of potential future disasters. In North Dakota, they've worked very closely with the city of Fargo to be able to develop capability.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and answer these so I don't burn through all the time. So you have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that spends money in addressing flood damage reduction projects, hurricane protection. The administration has budgeted, I believe it was $1 billion competition, resiliency competition through HUD. You have a climate resiliency fund that Department of Interior is trying to establish under the last budget request. I think it was $2 billion. FEMA has a hazard mitigation grant program and a pre-disaster mitigation program. Does it really make sense for us to have 5 different programs out there all attempting to address various aspects? Are these properly coordinated? Are they properly prioritized? And you know, the reason I bring this up, I'm from South Louisiana, and we've had more than our share of disasters, whether it be Hurricanes Katrina and Rita coming up from the south. We had record high water on the Mississippi River in 2011 and again this year in January for the first time ever. In January of this year, we had Hurricanes Gustav and Ike in 2008, Hurricane Isaac in 2012. We've had more than our share of disasters. And watching over and over again as we come in and we have FEMA come in and pick up the pieces after a disaster together with millions and millions of dollars spent by our parishes and spent by our state government, the Corps of Engineers in some cases, I can think of a project in St. John Parish, St. Charles Parish affecting Ascension, Livingston, and St. James parishes, that project has been in the study phase with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers now for over 40 years. Over 40 years. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, my point here is that, look, everyone wants us to reduce disaster spending. Everyone does. The solution here, as I think Ms. Clark noted, Mr. Kuhn noted, the solution here is making the principled proactive investments in making our communities more resilient. In recent years, we've had FEMA with their 500-year flood risk management regulations. We've had Biggert Waters and the revision of Biggert Waters in 2014. Biggert Waters in 2012, the revisions in 2014. We have proposals now to increase the cost share associated with disaster response on our counties, on our parishes, and our state governments. Mr. Chairman, my point is that making proactive investments is the solution to reduce our overall disaster expenses. We estimated that if we had spent somewhere around $8 or $9 billion, $8 or $9 billion, simply finishing authorized projects in South Louisiana that were supposed to be built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, we could have saved an estimated 90% of the about, and you can justify numbers anywhere from about 120 to 150 billion dollars that were spent in response to those 2005 hurricanes. We could have saved that. And not to mention, and very, very important, in fact, more important, Mr. Chairman, we think we could have saved over 90% of the 1,200 lives that were lost in South Louisiana. So all of these efforts by FEMA, I think, are being done in a vacuum. We need to be better coordinating our efforts to be proactive, to protect and make our communities and our ecosystem more resilient. and stop all this coming in after the fact and spending exponentially more dollars. There are studies, there are models, yet all we're seeing, rather than following the data, following the recommendations and the outcomes of these studies and these experiences following these catastrophic disasters, instead, we're further making disparate investments in programs that aren't really contributing or heeding the recommendations of these reports. I'm very concerned about this trend that we're seeing. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that in South Louisiana, much of our vulnerability is actually attributable to the actions of the federal government. We have lost 1,900 square miles of our coast. The majority of that is because of how the Corps of Engineers manages the water resources in this nation. That's why we've lost. That's why we've become more vulnerable. Arkansas doesn't care when hurricanes come because Louisiana is their buffer. Our buffer's disappearing, and that's why you're seeing these costs. And so I just want to urge the committee, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, as we move forward on legislation, we need to make sure we don't get too myopic in this view and that we're looking comprehensively at all of these efforts that are underway that, quite frankly, should be under this subcommittee's jurisdiction. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Sears?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, as we learn from all these disasters, Mr. Nimich, we picked up how to better construct better codes and everything else. Why do you think some of these states are so reluctant to do this mitigation codes and reinforcement? What do you think that is?
So I think the decision on building codes is almost always local, and those decisions based on other economic factors, desires for certain development. But I do think that we as the federal government need to continue to ensure that when we invest, it's invested to codes. Currently, FEMA has out for comment with our stakeholder groups changes to our public assistance program that would require whether a state has or a community has code or doesn't have code. If they don't, if they want us to build back their infrastructure, it will have to be built back to either a national or an international code. So we are taking it very seriously to say, even if a community doesn't feel that codes are of value, we do, and when we invest federal dollars, we will build back to a code.
You know, one of the things that bothers me about New Jersey is the fact that 3 years later, we'll still have people that have not gone back to their homes. And there's plenty of blame to go around. You know, I think that in terms of these disasters, you not only have to mitigate it before, but I think there's got to be some sort of post-disaster where you're ready to come in and watch over some of these guys that are the fraudulent applications and everything else, and not take years before we can come up with the people who are perpetrating a fraud. And to me, I think you have to be ready right after the disaster. Can you talk to that?
Yes, sir. And I can proudly say that we have moved rapidly since Katrina to ensure that we have programs that have as much protection as possible. But I will tell you, sir, that if we have to err on the side of supporting a valid requirement and a fraudulent requirement, we are likely to support that requirement. But we do. It takes a time to go back and relook. And as you know, in New Jersey now, you're seeing the first cases of prosecution of fraudulent, where people have taken money from those that need to recover in their primary homes, claiming that their secondary home was a primary home, and taking those dollars away from those people that need it. It does take time, and we have to realize that during that immediate post-disaster, we want to make sure that those people that need the money get it, and there will be people that take advantage of it, but we don't give up. And as you said, sir, it may take too long, but we don't stop. We continue to go back and recoup those monies from people that fraudulently or accidentally applied for resources that they didn't deserve. We're down below the national standard from financial institutions in recovering money, down below 1%. So I think we do a pretty good job of ensuring that the money goes to those people who deserve it and need it.
You know, I come around, I used to be one of these guys that you have to require certain things, and I come around a lot to providing incentives. Because if the federal government is going to give you some money, I think that mitigation codes or storm codes should be part of it. I look at these disasters in the Midwest. I see these tornadoes, Oklahoma. I'm not trying to single out Oklahoma, but it just seems that they get much more than anybody else. And I see where schools are even damaged. You know, to me, if the federal government's going to give the state money to build a school, you should require a stronger code to build the schools. And I understand that these schools were built before. But, you know, going forward, I think that's something that we should look into. Because some of these schools always, they serve as shelters, too, in some of these communities. And I see the damage in some of these schools and some of these homes. So I think I'm coming around to the idea of incentives, Mr. Chairman, to provide these people so they can build the kind of codes that they need to deal with some of these disasters. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now begin a second round of questions. Commissioner Clark, I understand your district had major wildfires that destroyed a tremendous number of homes and property. Can you explain some of the challenges you have had trying to mitigate the risk of post-fire flooding? And do you have any recommendations for Congress to improve our mitigation programs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we have obviously had, and I don't know what fair share is, but we've had more than our fair share of disasters in El Paso County, Colorado. What I'd like to talk about specifically is the things that I think we can do from a relations of a standpoint as to local community resiliency. And I think that what tends to happen, and it happens at the local level, the state level, and particularly at the federal level, is we have silos built up between agencies. The fire that happened in Waldo Canyon was almost more than 95% on federal forest land. That pre-mitigation needs to happen from the federal level because that's Forest Service, and the Forest Service is now spending more than 50% of its budget on, frankly, on responding to wildfires versus pre-mitigating ahead of time. We have no control over that at the local level. What we do have control over is working with fire-adapted communities, community wildfire protection plans, and providing incentives, as some have set up here, which is very important, but for individuals to be able to mitigate ahead of time, to provide fire-wise communities. I was just up in actually Crystal Park, which is a one-way in, one-way out community built up on the mountainside, and they have taken steps to do that. And some of those programs that help them buy fire equipment to be prepared locally, to take that ability to look at from a personal standpoint, to be able to provide that mitigation will be helpful. We tend to be really, you know, when we look at an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, doing that pre-mitigation ahead of time. I also think it's important to note that we have, when there is a disaster, and I have a small business, when the fire happened, I lost thousands of dollars of reservations, and then we have this rolling disaster that keeps happening to try and make sure that those that may not live in wildland interface areas where the drainage all comes down into a small community, to be able to look at the fact that that mitigation immediately following the fire will provide the resiliency to slow down the debris and the large flash floods that happen as a result. And it's hard to understand if you're not from Colorado, because if you're not from a western state that has those drainages that drain right down into it. So I think tearing down the silos, understanding there is an impact on small business and how devastating that can be. 1/3 of small businesses go out of business after a major incident, and I think that that is really important. And looking at the flexibility in the requirements, even though we definitely want accountability, but sometimes the requirements preclude you from even asking for the particular money that you may otherwise need.
Thank you. We talked a lot today about how much the federal government pays out for disasters, but the other major payers in disasters are insurance companies. Mr. Nelson, can you discuss how insured losses generally compare to the federal assistance provided in the wake of a disaster?
In the wake of a disaster, it's the role of the insurance company to make that insured whole again. And so we're paying for the building, we're paying for the contents. If you're a small business, we're giving you business income interruption coverage. We're also providing additional living expense. And so significant dollars compared to, usually individual grants or small grants to consumers. They're not going to make you whole again. They're not going to be enough to rebuild your home, in general speaking. So it's important. Insurance industry plays a major role in natural disasters. And our trends, because of the weather volatility, we've been seeing those trends go up. And so this is an important concept, because what do insurance companies do? We spread the risk over people and over time. And as the risk changes, the prices change. And so it's important that we bend the cost curve for the federal government and bend the cost curve for consumers.
I believe every one of you mentioned the importance of mitigation and how evidence shows that for every $1 invested, $4 is saved. Most federal mitigation funding is provided through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program after a disaster declaration. I ask this of every one of you on the panel, if we could give a brief answer. How can we more proactively address the mitigation and shift the investment to before the catastrophe?
Congressman Barletta, I think the first thing I need to do is again thank the committee and the Congress for this post-Sandy legislation that allows that mitigation money, that post-disaster mitigation money, to be identified much earlier in the process and then be applied as part of the recovery process. Clearly, as we look at all of the different mitigation programs we have pre-disaster, in 2015, Congress gave us the authority to do post-mitigation or hazardous mitigation for fire grants to be able to restore those burned areas in a much more robust way. I would ask that we could consider reauthorizing that ability to use the fire mitigation grants as a hazard mitigation grant developer. But the reality for us comes back to how do you incentivize every level, from the individual through insurance programs to the local, to the county, to the state, and the federal government to be able to invest in that. We believe that the deductible offers that opportunity. We continue to need to work with our stakeholders to define what the reasonable level of a deductible should be, and then how do those building codes and the investments that Ms. Clark has indicated that the counties and the communities do reduce that deductible in order to be able to support those communities that have invested in their own well-being. I do believe that it is mitigation that ultimately reduces the cost of a disaster, and we need to find proactive ways, as you've all indicated, to incentivize that approach.
Ms. Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As it relates to the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, it is a very important component of, I think, what communities need to be provided for. There are some issues, I think, within the HMGP programs that need more flexibility, however, in order to be able to utilize those funds best at the local level. We see sometimes that there is not an understanding of unique situations, and I will give an example. In 2012 was the Waldo Canyon fire. We just closed on 3 houses 2 weeks ago for several homes that were in the floodway as a result of a fire that happened on federal forest land. They had never had flooding ever before, and it's taken us really that length of time to get that completed. As it relates to additionally the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, we at our Office of Emergency Management appreciate being able to utilize those dollars, but sometimes the accountability, where you may see it as accountability, the paperwork is so extreme for such a small amount of money that it makes it really unusable for us to even apply for the grants. And so we do take it very seriously, but I think sometimes those programs need to be looked at as how can those dollars actually get to the folks that need the help and provide some additional assistance for those individuals who want to take personal responsibility for trying to reduce mitigation, to reduce the disaster, eventual disaster declarations by looking at being proactive on their own personal property. Black Forest Fire was almost entirely on private property. That was the second fire. So we have 2 different fires, and we've seen different problems in each of those.
Thank you. Mr. Kuhn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a director of the Florida Division of Emergency Management, I have the luxury of a fairly large staff and adequate funding. And so every time there are new programs out there, every time there are new incentives, I have personnel whom I can assign to that to make sure that we take full advantage of that program. However, a good number of states do not share that luxury, and a good number of the counties across the country do not have that same luxury. So every time a new program is put into place, they have to determine how they can help meet the needs of that program because they're using current staffing, current year budgeting at the potential for a payoff down the road. So I think a few things would assist in this effort. One would be, as Mr. Graves suggested, consider clarifying, consider consolidating, consider streamlining existing programs today rather than creating just additional new programs which would enhance the administrative burden on already overworked officials at the state and local level. I think a better data analysis of the true costs of disasters and how they impact all levels will help us calculate the true return on investment for our participation in these programs and help us make those decisions. And finally, moving the mitigation cycle, moving the mitigation program forward, and so that it's not something we start thinking about on day one of the recovery. It's something that is done ahead of the disaster, so that if the funding comes along with that disaster, we are ready on day one with actionable mitigation plans to help implementing those programs, and we don't rebuild exactly as we were before.
Thank you. Mr. Nelson?
First, I just want to start with we have to get the word out about mitigation. There's a perception that mitigation costs so much money to consumers. Travelers were a proud supporter of Habitat for Humanity. We went out and we built a dozen fortified homes along the coast of America, and I personally participated in building one in New Haven, Connecticut. The average cost was only 2 to 5% on new construction. And so we just have to make sure that consumers understand this. And so that's first. Second, clearly, you've got a difficult decision in front of us. You know, spending is so difficult in Congress today. Everyone understands that. But we have to consider spending more at pre-disaster mitigation funds. Again, proven techniques with IBHS and other studies. And evaluate that and evaluate streamlining some of these FEMA programs. Thank you.
Mr. Mickey?
Something that you do to check a box and get FEMA to sign a check over and move on. It's something that needs to be a proactive, positive investment to incentivize, again, those communities, as we're promoting through the Institute, to take those positive actions.
Thank you. Ranking Member Carson?
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Clark, Disaster Assistance Reform, the Act of 2015, the committee calls for a very comprehensive study on trends in disaster costs and losses. As you mentioned earlier, local government bears a large portion of the disaster cost, yet data is very scarce. What is NACO doing to collect the information so that the data can be considered as a part of the comprehensive study and ensure that current federal disaster costs are not just being shifted to local communities?
I'm assuming that's for me. I wanted to say that I think that brings up a
or Mr. Kuhn.
Oh, okay. I'll start, and then I think that that local government really is here from the government and here to help. We want to know from you how we can best provide you the data and the information for those of us who have done this before. And in my case, we've had 4 declared disasters. So we've got a lot of information, and I think it would be helpful to sit down with those communities that have been through the processes and all the different silos, and to be able to have feedback from us on how to change policies that may not be working in the best interests of, first of all, of our communities, and secondly, of our local governments.
Ranking Member Carson, the question you ask is a question that many of the folks asked as they were responding to the proposed deductible concept from FEMA, which is, how do we capture all of those costs? What's the methodology? What is going to apply in that situation? Is it you go out and remove a tree that just fell on the road overnight, or is there a certain threshold at which you start measuring those dollars? We still are having those kind of conversations to figure out exactly what costs do we need to capture. But I do agree that it is very important that we do so because, again, that helps feed the return on investment calculations that we need to do in this situation. The flip side of what I offered earlier and the fact that I have a fairly large agency and a fairly adequate budget is that the threshold for Florida to receive a presidential declaration is also fairly high. And so we can have a 10 or a 20 or even a $25 million disaster in the state of Florida that will not be eligible for a federal declaration. So every year the state of Florida spends hundreds of millions of dollars internally at the state and local level to help us recover from those situations. So I concur that we should develop a methodology by which we can all operate off the same sheet of music when understanding what these costs are.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Mr. Nelson, you mentioned in your testimony that the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, simulating disaster conditions on homes and businesses in a controlled environment. You mentioned that. What types of adjustments to building codes has the Institute found to be most effective in keeping a structure standing after a disaster, and how much would these changes cost during new construction?
You know, IBHS, we've come out with a program called Fortified. There's a bronze program. The bronze program concentrates on the roof coverings. And so we've looked at taping the roofs, the seams in the roof deck, and maybe that's about $500 to $1,000. And that prevents water intrusion in case you lose your shingles. So that's the first step. The second step that's proven techniques is really bolstering all your openings, either covering your openings or putting some other reinforcements in place. And then the gold standard is looking at the building kind of end to end, looking how it's anchored at your foundation, through the walls, and to the roof. And so these are techniques that we are very happy to say some states have embraced. Alabama, coast of Alabama, has now embraced the fortified standards within their codes in their coastal counties. And they've also put in a program to try and for mitigation grants. And so we're seeing a lot of success with this program. We're even seeing some builders voluntarily building these homes.
Thank you. And lastly, for fellow Hoosier, Mr. Mickey, the Polis Center provides valuable services necessary to understanding the disaster threat and risk. How does the Polis Center help us understand, make its services known to others, and can you expand on some of the successful collaborative projects with state and local entities that the center has taken?
Thank you for the opportunity to talk both about the Polis Center and quite honestly, the state that I'm very proud of, the state of Indiana. Polis has been around since 1989. We've got 27 years of successfully linking in community and academic expertise. Our goals are to build capacity in the state's agencies, the volunteer associations, the citizens of the state of Indiana, and so forth. We've done a lot of work in emergency management, but the reason that we've been successful is not because uniquely of the resources in our center, but because of the atmosphere that exists in the state of Indiana. Case in point, within Indiana, we've had the privilege of working with the Indiana Department of Homeland Security to complete mitigation plans in close collaboration with the counties and cities and towns of the state of Indiana. The approach we take is highly collaborative. So unlike many situations that we hear about where a plan is created and set aside on the shelf, if you would, which unfortunately I think does often happen, that plan becomes a living document, something that the community is engaged in, that people are brought to the table to discuss and be a part of. And I think that's a critical component of making mitigation a success. Part of the reason that we're also successful, and something I'm exceedingly proud of, is in the state of Indiana, we understand the importance of information. FEMA created a tool that I'm sure many of you are aware of a few years ago called HASIS-MH, and HASIS has become a very significant part of the portfolio of resources in the state of Indiana that we use. It's a technology that allows communities to estimate the impact of hazards, specifically floods, earthquakes, and hurricanes, and they're able to do that in a more profound and successful way by integrating local resources. Well, in my state, I'm happy to say that we have 100% of the counties that, even though they have disagreements, to be sure, they've managed to find a way to agree to share information. So anyone, anywhere, anytime can go out to the Indiana map and download every single parcel in the state of Indiana, road information, hydrology information, and of course, hazard information. That information, combined with other resources in the state, makes it possible for our citizens to be much better protected and much better able to respond to disasters than others might be. We have taken that success story, I'm proud to say, to other states as well, many other areas. In total, we've worked in over 36 states, including, I believe, everyone represented by members of this committee, and over 100 cities. Building capacity means building tools, it means building workflows, it means, very importantly, education, and not just in how to do hazard analysis, but also what that means to a community in terms of its long-term resiliency. We believe firmly in connecting the fabric of the community to the solution. So hunger, homelessness, issues like that are just as important in understanding how a community will or will not be resilient to a disaster as understanding whether a building is going to fall down or stay upright. And we look at all of those things and try to bring together in a synergistic way the conversations to allow people to take advantage of that knowledge.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay. Mr. Graves?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nimick, the Bigger Waters 12 directs FEMA to incorporate simulations of climate change into some of the estimates that you develop in regard to premiums. Could you discuss how FEMA is doing that and how you're addressing uncertainties in regard to climate models?
So through Bigger 12s, we've been required to use the best science possible to determine the flood risk maps, sir, and we continue to work with the scientific community and local communities to be able to identify what those potentials might be in the future in terms of climate adaptation, particularly with rising tides in flood zones.
Yeah, yep. And so the question is, how do you plan to address the uncertainties in regard to the models of future sea rise and potential for storm intensity changes and things along those lines?
Sir, I'll answer that for the record.
Thank you. Another question, the Technical Mapping Advisory Committee that was established, they indicated in a recent report that they believe that there was about a 40% uncertainty rate associated with some of the flood models that were used. If you take that degree of uncertainty, which is extraordinary, and you put on top of it trying to estimate future changes in sea rise, future changes in the potential for storm intensity and frequency, it seems like we're getting to a range of uncertainty that it's just no longer helpful to even use those types of models and predictive information. Could you comment on that?
Yes, sir. I don't think you can go to the extent of not using some sort of a model or a predictive capability when you're trying to determine whether mitigation and preventive actions need to be taken. So while there's a certain degree of uncertainty, we continue to use the best available information based on a wide range of scientific data that's available. Is there uncertainty? There's always uncertainty in it, but we have to start somewhere to be able to create a basis on which the risk exists in the community. As you well know, sir, in your area, we've just experienced floods in northern Louisiana that no one would have expected based on the science that was there. So there's a great deal of uncertainty when you deal with any weather event. So we need to continue to find the best science at the time that we create the risk map, and then as often as possible come back and reevaluate that science.
Yeah, and I certainly concur that we need to be using the best information we can in regard to informing decisions. The concern is that, as you know, there's significant consequences of determining flood maps and NFIP premiums, and with your 500-year flood risk management, there could be significant and severe financial implications. My point is that having such severe implications, yet having so much uncertainty with the predictive models, that's not necessarily a very comfortable combination of issues. And I just want to urge, as you move forward, that you keep that in mind, that you need to keep in mind the reliability of the information and models and take into account the consideration of financial implications on counties, parishes, and others moving moving forward. Director Kuhn, first I want to say that I know a number of people that know you, and you have a great reputation. Thank you for being here, and I appreciate your testimony. Week before last, Congress, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 2901, which was legislation, and Mr. Nelson, excuse me, I'm going to ask you a question on this as well. That bill, what it does is it begins, or it allows for private flood insurance to serve effectively as a surrogate for the NFIP. Sounds like a good idea. Private sector, in many instances, can be more efficient than government can. So face value sounds like it's a good idea. However, being from your area, being from the area where I was born and live, I'm very concerned that what we're going to see is we're going to see private insurers come in that start cherry picking the policies that have the lowest risk. And so what ends up happening under Biggert-Waters 12 and the reforms in 2014 is you're left with the policies that have higher risk. Now, Biggert-Waters 12 and the revisions from 2014 require that the loan that was given to NFIP following the 2015 floods, that it be repaid. It requires that a reserve fund be established. It requires that actuarial rates be charged under flood insurance. So my point is that the private sector insurance companies aren't going to have those same financial burdens. All they're going to have is whichever policies they choose. The NFIP is going to have now a smaller pool of ratepayers because the private sector is pulling some of those off. So you're going to have the higher risk, smaller pool that are still going to be subjected to establishing a reserve fund, paying off this debt of whatever it is, $17 billion. Are those concerns? Should I not be concerned about this? Is there something there that we should be concerned about? And should NFIP reform be more comprehensive than just doing H.R. 2901?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think actually the debt is closer to $23 billion on the National Flood Insurance Program.
Thank
I think
you.
they'd like to get to $17 billion. The answer, my opinion, is that there needs to be more comprehensive reform of the National Flood Insurance Program, and I would urge this committee to become engaged with that conversation next year when it's up for reauthorization to work with the Financial Services Committee on that, because there's lots of components of the National Flood Insurance Program that I think directly relate to the conversation we're having here today with regards to mitigation activities that can take place across the country. One of the things that I express quite frequently in the state of Florida, and did just so yesterday before the Governor's Hurricane Conference General Session, as a result of some of the actions during Biggert-Waters of 2012, we've seen a significant reduction in the number of flood insurance policies across the country, and specifically in the state of Florida. The state of Florida has lost over 10% of the flood insurance policies. We've gone from just north of 2 million flood insurance policies in the state to about 1.8 million. What that means is those citizens, the next time they have a disaster, next time they have a flood in their community, they are not going to be able to recover like they would have had they had flood insurance, and there will be additional costs imposed upon the federal government because they may now be eligible for assistance from FEMA, they may be eligible for assistance from the state, et cetera. So those costs are going to be borne by the individuals, those costs are going to be borne by government. So a comprehensive analysis and reform of the National Flood Insurance Program, I believe, is completely appropriate at this point. Florida, last year in the legislative cycle, did do some things to reduce some of the regulatory burdens on private flood insurance in the state of Florida, and so now there are private insurers offering flood insurance policies in the state. It's very nascent at this point. There's probably 2,000 to 3,000 private flood insurance policies in the state, but it is a start. I do share your concern about some of the cherry-picking aspects, and I'm not an insurance expert, and I'll defer to Mr. Nelson on that. But we have had a similar situation in the state of Florida with the Citizens Insurance Company on the Windborne Insurance. They have depopulated a large segment of their policies to the private market and still remained financially feasible. So I believe Mr. Nelson may be able to elaborate on that a little bit. But I believe, again, comprehensive reform of the National Flood Insurance Program is absolutely appropriate at this point and can tie in some of the mitigation activities that we've discussed thus far.
Thank you. First, let me say I would echo your concerns that you're raising. I think those are profound issues that we have to evaluate.
Mr. Chairman, for the record, I just want to note that he called me profound.
Yes. Yes. So I do think if you just step back for a minute, travelers, let me just back up. Travelers, we do write flood insurance on a commercial basis for commercial insurance. We do not write homeowners flood insurance, and we have no plans to enter that market. We also do not have a formalized position on this. I'll just express my own points of view. So when you look at it, I've looked at a lot of the FEMA rate plans. I think they need to modernize their rate plan. The private industry should not be able to compete with FEMA on price. Remember, we have to buy reinsurance. We have to have enough capital to meet our obligations. That means we have to have a pool of money. Typically, that's our shareholders' money, so they have to get a return on that. We should not be able to compete with FEMA. And so you step back, their plan needs to be modernized. Their rate plan, I've looked at it, it's not at all consistent with how the private sector looks at insurance, sells insurance, and has a rating plan. So let's start with that. Let's modernize the program, and then let's evaluate how we can privatize to think about that cherry-picking aspect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your generosity.
Thank you. I think Mr. Graves made a good point earlier that Congress needs to look across the federal government, including levees and flood control projects, when we try to bend the cost curve of disasters. The disaster cost study in our FEMA authorization bill should help and make such recommendations to Congress. And I also want to thank Administrator Fugate for the disaster deductible proposal. I don't know if it is the right solution, but we need a vigorous debate and innovative ideas if we are to drive down losses and not just shift costs between payers. And I want to thank you all for your testimony. Your comments today have been helpful in our discussion. If there are no further questions, I would ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I'd like to thank our witnesses again for their testimony today. If no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee stands adjourned.